Welcome. In this video, we are going to be reviewing our architecture and doing the last little touches that are required to put our input controller directly in control of pulling the trigger, putting the AI directly in control of pulling the trigger. So I'd like to show you what we've achieved, but more it's about what we have no longer got there. We've got this blueprint animation controller, and it is currently without any talk of shooting whatsoever. That's now all been eradicated from the animation layer, and we'll also be hooking up our firing trigger in C++ over here. So you can see that this is hooking up the bind action to fire to pull the trigger on the mannequin, and we'll be doing some re-architecting of our shoot blueprint task so that that also is responsible for pulling the trigger. So it's all about who's pulling the trigger in this lecture, so let's dive right in. So let's start with a brief review of the architecture that we saw in the previous lecture. So this is the architecture as we saw it, and so far we've done very well on implementing this. So we've got the gun back in charge, spawning the projectiles, being told by the character. In fact, it's not being told via a kind of request mechanism, it's being told via an on-fire notification. So the character is saying on fire to the projectile spawns, not the projectile, the gun, then the projectile spawns and it goes through and triggers an animation, at the moment only on the first person mesh, but in future it will be doing this on the third person mesh as well. It can actually just tell both of them to do different animations, so that's great. So that's our improved architecture, and pretty much we have this, except for who pulls the old trigger. At the moment, we have the input components are triggering into the animation blueprint. They're telling it, setting a shooting boolean, and then that shooting boolean starts off a process of playing a shooting animation in the third person animation blueprint, which then triggers a notification back up to the mannequin, which then calls the trigger or the fire function on the mannequin, which then calls the gun. And there's a very similar process from a BT task, from the shoot BT task. It also sets the booleans in the animation blueprint. That's just roundabout and horrible and relies on the third person animation blueprint, as we've already said. So this is the old way. The new way is that the input components and BT task are going to trigger the mannequin directly. And how are we going to do this? Well, let's go ahead and have a look. So if I hop on over into Unreal, the first port of call is that input component. Where is that happening? If I hear you ask, well, where is that input component? Well, we've got this binding of input action fire. That's actually coming from, it's binding an action from the input component to do something in our blueprint. And as you can see, what it's doing is it's setting these Boolean variables, which then get pulled across into the animation blueprint. Ugh, it's making me scared just at the thought. So let's delete this altogether. I'm going to save and compile, and it's obviously, you don't even need to go ahead and try this out to know that the first person example, the game, is not going to work. You're not going to be able to fire. So we need to revise some blueprint, some binding in C++, sorry, not in Blueprint. And that's the next step, revising the binding in C++. So let's go over to Visual Studio, where I handily already have my mannequin class open at the right place. You can bring it to that point too. And you'll see that here we have a function already implemented when we took from the character, when we derived from the character, it had a setup player input component already there. Now, what does setup player input component do? Well, it says if I'm being possessed by a player, then connect my input component to the relevant bindings on this character. So that's all great, but our mannequin is not actually being used always by a player. Sometimes it's being used by AI, so you don't necessarily want to bind if it's being used by AI. So you might be tempted at this point to go in here and do a binding like so. I say player input, if I can type correctly, player input component, arrow bind action, and then I can take a little bit of inspiration from the player first person character.cpp, that old class that we have now subsequently superseded. But in here we've got a bind somewhere, if I can find it. Here we go, set up player input component. And you can see my bind actions look like this. And I'm just going to take this bit from the bind action forward, and I'm going to take it over to the mannequin C++ and replace it here. And just rename the action to fire, which was the action that we wanted to bind. And, well, what do I want to bind it to? I could bind it to our current fire method. But the problem is, if I bind to our fire method, we are going to have a few problems because this gun might not be set yet. And in fact, that is the case because our setup player input component happens before our begin play. So what could happen in the worst case is that an action comes through, or during the binding process, we call to this gun and the gun is just not there. So what we want to do is do this on begin play after we've created the gun. I mean, that makes sense, right? Except again, problem. Here, if we have an AI controlling this mannequin, there will not be an input component for us to get hold of. Usually you can get hold of the input component as a class member that's inherited from character. But that will be null if we aren't possessed by a player. So we need to do a check. If input component is not equal to null, well then rather straightforwardly, we are going to go ahead and say, well, let's bind it to our very own fire method. You could bind it straight onto the gun, but seeing as we have a fire method here anyway, let's go ahead and bind it onto our fire method. Now, instead of typing it out, I'm lazy. I'm going to go ahead and copy this from the first person character. And by the way, copying code is no bad thing. It is really what all the programmers, all the cool kids are doing, and it's not plagiarism. It's not anything to worry about. So let's do a mannequin, because that is the class of our class. I'm going to call fire. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and hit compile on that one. Okay, our compile's complete. Let's go ahead and hit play. So let's see whether our binding has worked. Yes, it has. We're now able to shoot without having that binding in the blueprint. So that has taken us a step closer to this architecture. It's no longer going through the animation blueprint on the input component side. So now we need to look at our BT task side and remove it from there. So that is going to be the challenge for the lecture. And let's go ahead and take a look at that challenge in full. So we're going to be directing the direct firing control. That is basically doing the gun first. So we're going to rename that fire function that we have on mannequin to pull trigger, just to be more in line, and also to break all the references that are in the blueprint so that we can go out and strip them out. So we want to go and strip them from basically the animation blueprint. So you should not be calling it from the animation layer at all, because it should be coming from the BT task and it should be coming from our input component. And then when you've done that, you'll notice that there's a whole load of blueprint in the animation blueprint that is to do with shooting animations, playing shooting animations, variables with shooting animations, and you can just get rid of all of that because none of that is necessary. You'll notice that that then will cause some problems in our BT task, and our BT task then needs to be updated so that it is calling our pull trigger and it's firing exactly once, and then it stops. So basically the task is to fire and pull the trigger exactly once. And you will notice that if you do that, it will lead to rapid firing because of the way that our blueprint, our behavior tree is set up. And that's fine. For now, it's fine. We're going to look at how to make things into rapid burst firing in the next lecture. But for now, it's enough to get the shoot BT task to fire exactly once. So go ahead and have a go at this challenge. Okay, welcome back. So I'm going to go and dive right in. I'm going to tackle this challenge in two parts. First is the removing the firing from animation BP. So the first thing to do is to rename fire in our mannequin header. So where we've got that fire function, which is a blueprint callable, I'm going to rename it to pull trigger. Now I'm doing this completely manually without any help from the IDE because, well, sometimes it's just fun to do things in the masochistic way. So I'm going to rename the fire that is called by our input binding, because it's now pull trigger rather than fire. And I'm going to rename the declaration or the definition. I think I'm talking about the definition. Pull trigger. There we go. And hopefully there won't be any sort of complaining from the compiler. So let's go ahead and start that compile process. But in the meantime, I'm going to show you, well, that in our ABP TP, Animation Blueprint third person, I'm going to stop expanding that acronym soon. We have a lot of code to do with shooting. So the first place that you'll notice the code to do with shooting is just in the variables. We've got this shooting variable that if we are playing, will start shooting animation. We don't need this here because that's going to be done from the gun. So I'm going to delete that shooting variable. Yes, I do want to delete it. And it now should say that it seems to have got on okay without that variable, but I can tell you that there were some places where it was used. And one of those places is in the anim graph, where we try to blend in the iron sights animation. So we can remove this blending node altogether. If we hit compile, you'll notice that it looks completely weird. The reason it looks completely weird is because we've got this apply mesh space additive without anything in the additive node. So we know that doesn't work very nicely. So I'm going to remove it and just pass through the pose from the previous node. Let's go ahead and hit compile. It now tells me that there's a compile error, but that's because the C++ finished compiling at exactly the same time. If we look at our compile error, you'll see that it's talking about this fire function because we've now renamed it to pull trigger, but we don't want it being called from here. So we can say that in response to this anim notify fire, we're not going to do anything. So I'm going to remove this whole block of blueprint and recompile. And now you can see we don't have a shooting button, a shooting variable at all. And we don't have anything in the anim graph relating to shooting. Now, one more place to go and have a look is in our event graph and see whether anything tries to pull the shooting over from mannequin to here. So I'm going to have a look at our bind character state. I assume that looks like the culprit. Yes, we've removed the set shooting node, but we've still got this shooting variable coming from our mannequin. We don't need that anymore. We can remove that as well. And we pretty much removed all the references to shooting in our animation blueprint. Now, the other thing, we had that variable, that shooting variable in our BP character. So I'm going to go up to the BP character and I am going to remove that shooting variable right here. And hopefully that's still going to be fine if I go ahead and compile the blueprint. It does seem to be okay. And well, there's the final bit of the task, which is to control the trigger from the AI. So let's go ahead and change that in the AI. I have my shoot BT task open here, and as you can see, my shoot BT task is in fact giving me an error at the moment, which makes sense. I'm going to remove that set, like so, and I'm going to remove this redirect node. And in fact, you'll notice that we've got two events here, the execute AI and the abort AI. Well, if we don't want to be shooting multiple times, then we want the abort to essentially be coming from within shoot. Shoot should finish as soon as it has pulled the trigger. So we no longer need this abort, really. We can get rid of it entirely. However, execute does need to finish. So at the end of execute, we're going to need to call the finish execute node and make sure that it finishes with success by hitting the little success checkbox. And what that does is once we've called our shooting, we are going to finish. Now, that means that we return the execution flow and do the next thing in the behavior tree. Now, I'm going to remove this set because it's now erroneous, and I'm going to remove its redirect node. And we are going to replace that set. We still need to set focus. We still need to aim. So that all can be done, and I'm going to put execution flow through there. But once we've set focus, there's something else we need to do. We need to pull the trigger. And you'll notice that we're doing this cast to BP character in order to get the methods and functions on BP character. We no longer need it to be BP character, though. It doesn't need to be so far down the inheritance chain. It can just be the mannequin. So I'm going to remove that cast and change the cast to if I search for mannequin, cast to mannequin, and using that cast to mannequin, let's see. It doesn't let us set aiming. Well, let's get rid of aiming for now. I don't think that's going to work as we expect anyway, because, well, aiming is being set for just one shot, and that doesn't quite make sense. We might need to work that into the behavior tree at a higher level. Like if we can see the enemy, then we start aiming. That might need to be a service rather than part of the shooting behavior tree, which is kind of a hack at the moment. Okay, so we set the focus though, that is important. We know what we're aiming at. And then we cast to mannequin, and then from mannequin, we are going to pull the trigger, which is a very straightforward and easy method to remember. I'm going to add in a redirect node here for pretties, and then the pull trigger is going to go on to the finish execute, and it will finish execute successfully because there's no circumstances for it to fail. You just pull the trigger and hope for the best. So we're going to save our shoot node, and we are going to go and have a go at playing our first person map. Now, I can shoot. Can the AI shoot if I go up to them? Yes, even too much. Gosh, that is loud and too much shooting for sure. So that's fine at the moment. We have got it so that it is shooting just once, and the rapid firing we're seeing there is because it just keeps trying to shoot because it's still a valid thing to do. So we're going to figure out how to stop it being a valid thing for the behavior tree to do in the next lecture. But for now, it looks like our tasks are complete in Sublime, and we have this direct firing control challenge completely completed. We've renamed, we have gone through the animation layer and stripped everything out. We've even got the BT task to be firing just once. So we have re-architected towards that lovely architecture here, where the input component and BT task call on the mannequin to pull the trigger, which then calls the gun. And in the next lecture, we are going to be sorting out the weird rapid firing and make things look a little bit more natural with a few bursts of fire at random intervals, and everything will look very cool, and our AI will start to feel a little bit more human, less robotic. So let's go ahead and see what happens in that lecture.